Welcome to the second episode of Guitars in the Wild. I'm Randy from Randock Guitars, and we're going to attempt to build an acoustic guitar and a ukulele out in the wild. Lots of stuff to cover today, really interesting stuff about Tonewoods and Rosettes and all kinds of stuff. But before we can get started on that, I've got to set up my tent, I guess. So anyway, I've got to set up the tent and get ready in order to get started. So I'm going to start doing that, and we'll be back. So before we can get started on the rosettes, one of the things that I wanted to do was take sound samples of the wood that we're going to be using for this build. So I set up my microphone and some recording equipment, and let's check out what these wood samples sound like straight out of the box in the raw. So as you can plainly hear, those are huge differences in sound. This might sound very weird to the layman, but every species of wood has its own tonal characteristics, its own sound that it imparts. And within the species itself, you also get a wide variety of sounds depending on the conditions under which the tree grew up under. For those of us who are into guitars, we're quite used to this conversation and debate over tonewood. But we tend to think in very general terms. In the sense of, rosewood is brighter, mahogany is going to give you a warmer sound. While these things are not necessarily untrue, I think that we're doing a disservice to ourselves by thinking of wood in this particular way. So I want to explore the tonal properties of the wood, but I also want to go into how sound behaves within the wood itself, and how to align those properties and behaviors to our advantage when we're designing an acoustic guitar. One of the problems that we encounter in trying to demonstrate those things, though, is that when you get to boards this size and of this thinness, millimeters make a huge difference into how the board behaves. And so, in order to solve that, I came up with this, a xylophone. So you might be wondering, how are you going to work on this stuff out here, right? Well, number one, I've got my bag of tools all in here. But more importantly, one of the things that I did was I made a portable work table. Check it out. So, legs flip open. All right. The top opens up. And fretboards that we'll be working on next. We have our guitar parts, and they're all protected inside our little work table here. I think it's a fairly clever solution and just the right height to work on. So you're impressed. What's even more impressive is there wasn't just one table at the campsite, there were three. Rosettes have a really rich and beautiful history. They date back to the distant cousin of the modern guitar, the Arabic oud. They traditionally have these very intricate and ornate carvings in the sound holes. In the Renaissance and Baroque periods, this transferred to the early stringed instruments of the time, and you can see them incorporated in lutes. Then from the 8th to the 15th century, a significant portion of the Iberian Peninsula was under Moorish rule. The Andalusian region of Spain became like a melting pot for all these different cultures, including Islamic and Christian and Jewish traditions. This interaction influenced the art and architecture and music of the region. Moorish art is known for its complex geometric patterns. These patterns often include interlacing designs, stars, polygons, and intricate shapes that come together in very mathematical ways. Luthiers in Spain from the region adopted the geometric arabesque patterns for the rosettes of their guitars. The symmetrical nature of these designs lent itself to the circular format of the rosette. And one of the most famous guitar makers, Antonio de Torres, who often is considered the father of modern classical guitar, incorporated Moorish-inspired designs into his rosettes, and his work has basically set the standard for all future luthiers. I was thinking about all this as I considered the designs for the rosette and the guitars I was making. Being of Spaniard and Moorish descent myself, I felt that I should really honor these traditions in my design.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
Instead, what I kept thinking about was the eclipse that we had on April 8th. I was about 50 miles away from totality, so I ended up seeing this really, really thin crescent, and it stuck with me ever since. What I wanted to do was some sort of abstract variation of the eclipse, and so this is the design I came up with. So ultimately, I'm glad I did actually make the table because number one, I need something to protect the guitar parts, but number two, I definitely don't want to be working on these surfaces. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to be filling in those grooves that were made with the Dremel, and we're going to be using these pieces of Padauk that we've bent, and we're going to double them up, and we're going to inlay those in there. After the fact, then we'll come back in, and on these lines, we'll be drawing out, and we'll be doing those in a different way. All right, so part one is done. The rings of the eclipse thing is sort of done. There's going to be gaps. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to fill those, but I think for the most part it'll be all right. I got them in there because it looks like it actually might rain. Hopefully it doesn't, but looks like it might. In the meantime, I need some coffee. That took a lot longer than I thought I was going to. Okay, so why make a xylophone out of this entire thing? And basically what it boils down to is standardization. So what I wanted to do is eliminate all those variables and kind of sort of make a bunch of standard pieces. They're all the same size, they all have the exact same curve, and then we can see what each piece of wood brings to the table by eliminating all that other stuff. I'm not an expert at this. I'm not pretending to be an expert. This is how I learn. This is how I like to learn. I don't know if there are really any experts when it comes to any of this stuff. But I kind of sort of like doing this because you can decide for yourself after the demonstrations or from what you hear, and maybe you can come to your own conclusion. So again, we're going forward with a lot of humility. If you have a different opinion or if you have different sources, by all means, leave a comment down below and let me know. So the first thing I want to talk about is density. Density is just how much mass there is per cubic foot. So let's go ahead and hear these examples and see if there's any correlation. The Wenge tops off at 54. The rosewood is at 52. The maple is at 44. The ash is at 42. And the limba is at 35. So density usually correlates with the ability to resonate, right? And in other words, to ring a little bit longer, sustain. For example, metal, like this aluminum here. Usually the higher density, the more of that ringing you're going to wind up getting. Although if you notice, the densest one of all didn't resonate all that much, which is the Wenge, but we'll get back to that. Now you would think that this is exactly what it is that we're looking for, but there's a trade-off with density. In other words, a guitar only has so much force in the string, and so you can only impart so much string onto the guitar body. With a guitar, we have very little energies that we're working with, and the denser something is, the heavier it's going to be. And that means that the string might not have enough energy, no matter how hard we strike it, to get that top moving or to get the guitar moving enough to create the vibration that we need in order to make a note. Also, what you wind up noticing is that the more resonant something is, the more amplitude it has, the narrower the frequency range is. So for example, you can have really, really high amplitude of resonance, but what's going to wind up happening is the frequency gets shorter and shorter, and so you end up with a very narrow frequency. Think of a tuning fork. A tuning fork has a very narrow frequency of, like, let's say it's tuned to an A, but it won't resonate or move at all with a C sharp. It won't resonate with a D. That doesn't suit our purposes for a guitar either. So we want resonance, but we want resonance with a much wider Q value. In other words, we want resonance across a wider frequency. And we also don't want so much density that we can't move that top or impart enough energy into it in order to produce the sound that we need. Okay, the second quality I want to talk about is the Janka hardness rating. Basically, it's just how hard a piece of wood is. Now, you might think this is really correlated with density, right? The denser, the harder it would be, but that's not necessarily the case. Think about a bag of sand. A bag of sand is going to have a lot of weight to it. It's going to have a lot of density. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be very hard. You can probably push your finger into it. But slam a hammer into a bag of sand and you're not going to get much resonance or much sound. So I rearranged the keys in order of Janka ratings, and so let's take a listen to what that does. The Rosewood at 2480. The Wenge at 1900. The Maple at 1400. The Ash at 1300. And the Limba at a very soft 670. The last quality I want to talk about is damping. Damping basically means the ability of something to absorb sound or to stop the vibration of a sound. So one of the materials that are the most damping would be something like a piece of rubber. It's going to be used for the exact opposite, sound deadening. Now there's a few things to think about because we can turn one piece of wood into either a resonant piece of wood or a damping piece of wood. So for example, if you look down here at the xylophone again, what you'll notice is that the Wenge has grain running sideways. And you notice that the Maple and the Ash have grain running in the correct direction along the key. So these seem to be resonating just fine, yet the Wenge doesn't seem to be resonating at all. So the reason for that is because when sound travels with the grain, it's moving at about 7,000 meters per second, right? But when it travels across the grain, it's actually traveling at about 2,000 meters per second. So that's a huge drop, and that means that we've turned that piece of wood just by changing the grain direction from something that's going to resonate to something that's damping. For example, I've got this other piece of Wenge here, and it's much bigger. This is going to be for the fretboard. And I want you to hear what this sounds like. Now that we've kind of sort of had a demonstration of all these qualities, how do we put it to use? In the next part, we'll explore that. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Randy, not that instant shit again. And I had some lovely people give me some really good advice about getting a mocha pot. And I was going to take that advice, but I forgot. It's still shit. I got to wait about an hour and a half for that glue to dry. So what I'm thinking about doing is going for a bit of a hike. So this is Croton National Park. It's about 2 hours north of New York City. It was nice, but not as remote as I expected. So I got back and went straight to work, and I have to admit it was nice working in silence. So, first part of this one is done. Needs to be cleaned up. All right, so now that we've kind of sort of done this deep dive on all this wood and stuff, what does all this mean? How do we put it to use? Well, number one, I think the more you know about the woods that you're working with, the more chances you have of getting the best performance out of each piece. I think ultimately having a lot of experience with a lot of different types of wood, knowing how they behave and what their characteristics are really going to help inform the decisions you make when working with them. But ultimately, I think we're kind of sort of starting at the end, right? I think about Segovia when he said that an acoustic guitar is kind of like an orchestra in your hands. Every string has its own voice. I think you can say that about the entire guitar in general. Ultimately, every part in an acoustic guitar is part of the orchestra. And what they contribute and what you choose to have each part play is going to give you the final composition. And so knowing which wood choices you're going to make, grain direction you're going to use, how you're going to incorporate all these parts to get them to play together will really help you achieve whatever it is that you're trying to. Whether you're trying to create a vision that's in your head or whether it's a voice that maybe a client is looking for. But ultimately, I think it's all those other things that take priority. Scale length, bracing system, curvature of the back and sides, bridge type. I think those are the things you want to focus on first. I think then wood choice becomes like the seasoning of the meal. With that in mind, I wanted to talk to you guys about two books that I've been using in order to kind of sort of inform us along the way. The first one is by R.M. Motola, Building the Steel String Acoustic Guitar. This is like your standard operating procedure. If you've never built an acoustic guitar before, if you're brand new to acoustic guitars and just want to get into it, it's a fantastic book to read. Very traditional in the way that it builds. And then you have this other book, Giovanni Nicoletti, which is the entire opposite end of the spectrum, Mastering the Sound of the Acoustic Guitar. And this is all about measurement, cutting edge technology, equations, really geeking out on a lot of things. This is very cutting edge, and this one's very traditional. So if you're really interested in this stuff and you really want to learn a lot, like and subscribe. We have some really, really cool topics to get into in the upcoming episodes. So I'm really looking forward to some of the stuff that we're going to do. Well, here they are. They obviously need to be cleaned up a little bit, but they're looking pretty cool. Once the center circle is cut, it's going to look a lot better.